Hey guys, welcome back to Beyond the Box Score, and I am your host Hayat. Today we're breaking down 4 college basketball matchups for March 11th, and we've got Pittsburgh versus NC State, LSU versus Kentucky, Mississippi State versus Auburn, and Wyoming versus UNLV, and each one of these games has something interesting in the data, whether it's a weird spread, a head-to-head result that doesn't match the current line, or a scoring trend that could shape how the game unfolds. So the goal here isn't to pretend we know exactly what's going to happen, the goal is to walk through the logic. If these games play out like the numbers suggest, if certain matchups show up the way they have recently, and if the momentum trends actually carry over, then these spots start to make a lot more sense. That's what we're doing today, breaking it down piece by piece, thinking through the scenarios, and connecting the dots the same way I would if we were just talking hoops together. And real quick before we dive in, the channel is pushing toward 2K subscribers, so if you enjoy these raw, full slate breakdowns and you want to see more college basketball analysis like this during tournament season, hitting that subscribe button helps the channel grow a lot. Alright, let's get into it and start connecting the dots. First we have Pittsburgh versus NC State. The lean here is Pittsburgh plus 7.5. Let me walk through why, because the more I sit with this matchup, the more this number just feels a little heavy for the way NC State is playing right now. The opening spread here is NC State minus 7.5 with a total sitting at 144.5, and right away I start asking myself what version of NC State we're actually getting. Because if this matchup plays out like the recent form we've seen, that minus 7.5 starts to look pretty uncomfortable. NC State just lost to Notre Dame on the road while laying minus 6.5 in that game. And that's one of those results that makes me pause for a second, because a team laying minus 6.5 on the road and then losing outright tells you something about where they are mentally and rhythm-wise. And then you stack another result on top of that, NC State losing to Stanford at home while laying minus 9.5. That's another spot where the expectation from the market was dominance, and instead the result went the other direction. So when I'm looking at NC State now being asked to cover minus 7.5, I keep coming back to the same thought: where is the stability here? Where is the confidence that this team is going to create separation? Because the opponent comparison here is interesting too. Pittsburgh beat Stanford. NC State lost to Stanford. So if the Stanford results are part of the puzzle, the team getting plus 7.5 here actually has the better recent outcome in that specific overlap. Now I know Pittsburgh has been described as one of the worst teams in the ACC this season. Some people even saying they might be the worst team in the ACC, and normally that kind of label would make me immediately nervous about grabbing points. But what connects for me is the timing. Pittsburgh just beat Stanford on Tuesday, and if this matchup plays out like a momentum swing situation, that Tuesday win could matter. Sometimes when teams that have struggled finally get a result like that, you start seeing a little spark, a little belief. Guys playing for each other, the bench energy picking up, rotations tightening. One path I see here is Pittsburgh coming into this game with that Tuesday win still fresh, still fueling them, while NC State is dealing with the aftertaste of losing to Stanford at home while laying minus 9.5. And when I put that together with the total at 144.5, I start thinking about game scripts. If the game lives around that 144.5 range and possessions trade back and forth without one team completely exploding offensively, that plus 7.5 starts to matter even more, because every stretch where Pittsburgh keeps it close is pressure on NC State to extend the margin. And that's the thing, I'm not convinced this NC State team right now is built to extend margins the way a minus 7.5 favorite normally would. If this matchup plays out like a grind, if Pittsburgh keeps competing the way they did Tuesday, if NC State continues looking a little broken like they have in these recent losses, then suddenly the possibility of Pittsburgh hanging around the entire game becomes very real. And honestly, another path I see here is the outright scenario. Because if Pittsburgh already beat Stanford and NC State lost to Stanford at home while laying minus 9.5, the gap between these teams might not be what the number is suggesting right now. So when I circle back to the opening spread of NC State minus 7.5 with the total at 144.5 and layer in NC State losing to Notre Dame on the road while laying minus 6.5 and losing to Stanford at home while laying minus 9.5. And then I remember Pittsburgh beat Stanford on Tuesday. The story that forms in my head is a game that's way more competitive than the spread suggests. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at Pittsburgh plus 7.5. Next game we have LSU versus Kentucky. The lean here is LSU plus 8. Let me walk through why, because when I start thinking through this matchup, the first thing that jumps out is the setting and the context. This is the SEC Championship, first round being played in Nashville, and the line right now has Kentucky minus 8 with a total of 151.5. And right away my brain goes to that total of 151.5 because it suggests a fairly active offensive game environment, and when a total is sitting at 151.5 while the spread is minus 8. The question becomes whether the favorite is actually capable of separating enough inside that pace. LSU comes into this with a 15-16 straight-up record, which on the surface looks rough, and I know that record makes people immediately think this team is just bad. But when I start digging into the matchup structure, I keep seeing the same thing. Offensively these teams are very comparable. In fact, LSU is better in a few offensive categories than Kentucky, which is interesting because the narrative around this matchup doesn't always reflect that. Where Kentucky does hold an edge is defensively, and LSU is weak at stopping offenses. So that's the part of the puzzle that can't be ignored. If this matchup plays out like a defensive control game from Kentucky, then you can see how the minus 8 might start making sense. But there's another layer here that keeps pulling me the other direction, and it's the previous meeting between these teams. They already played on January 14th at LSU, and Kentucky only won that game by 1 point. Just one. That's a huge piece of context for me because if these teams already showed they can play a game decided by 1 point, it becomes harder for me to picture a scenario where the gap suddenly jumps all the way to minus 8 without something dramatically changing. And when I think about program momentum, that's where the narrative around Kentucky becomes interesting. Kentucky is getting line respect, and part of that respect is simply the brand. You see the letters U and K together and it triggers that blue blood perception in people's minds. But when I think through what this program actually looks like right now, the commentary has been consistent. Kentucky is having a down year. And not just this season. There's also the mention that they had a down year last season as well. So when I'm processing Kentucky minus 8 with a total of 151.5 in the SEC Championship, first round in Nashville against an LSU team that already kept it within 1 point on January 14th at LSU, I keep landing on the same scenario paths. One path I see is the offensive comparison playing out exactly how the numbers suggest, both teams trading scoring stretches because they're very comparable offensively and LSU even has advantages in a few offensive categories. Another path I see is Kentucky's defensive edge showing up but not necessarily creating separation, more like controlling stretches without completely pulling away. And if LSU is weak at stopping offenses, that actually feeds into the idea of a higher scoring environment that keeps the total hovering near that 151.5 range. Which again makes the plus 8 feel important because points accumulate but margins don't necessarily explode. And when I replay that January 14th meeting in my head, Kentucky winning by 1 point, I keep asking the same question: what changed so dramatically that this matchup suddenly requires an 8-point cushion? Because if LSU with a 15-16 straight-up record was able to keep that game within 1 on January 14th at LSU, then one very realistic script here is another tight contest where Kentucky's defensive edge shows up but LSU's offensive competitiveness keeps the scoreboard within striking distance. And when you mix the brand respect of U and K, the down-year conversation around Kentucky this season and last season, the comparable offenses, the defensive edge for Kentucky, and that January 14th game decided by 1 point, the picture I keep coming back to is LSU hanging around longer than the number expects. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at LSU plus 8. Quick pause for a second. If you've got an even one lean you like so far from these college basketball matchups today, hit the like button. It tells me these full slate breakdowns for games like Pittsburgh versus NC State, LSU versus Kentucky, Mississippi State versus Auburn, and Wyoming versus UNLV are actually worth doing. And again, the channel is working toward 2K subscribers, so if you enjoy the way we break these games down, the numbers, the trends, the thinking out loud style, hitting like and subscribe takes a second for you, but it helps the channel more than you probably realize. Next we go with Mississippi State versus Auburn. The lean here is Mississippi State plus 7.5. Let me walk through why, because the more I think about this matchup, the more the number itself just starts bothering me a little bit. This game is being played at the Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, Tennessee on a neutral site, and when you remove home court from the equation I immediately start re-evaluating spreads like this. Auburn is laying minus 7.5 with a total sitting at 158.5, and that's a pretty big number when the teams have already shown us something earlier this season. Because if this matchup plays out anything like the previous meeting, the number looks very aggressive. These teams played once this season and Mississippi State won outright. Not only did Mississippi State win outright, they scored 91 points against Auburn and won that game by 6. That's the head-to-head data sitting right in front of us, Mississippi State scoring 91 and winning by 6, and now we're in a neutral site environment at Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, Tennessee with Auburn laying minus 7.5. So one path I see here is asking a simple question: what changed enough to justify that shift? Because if Mississippi State already proved they can put up 91 against Auburn and win by 6, then the idea that they can stay within plus 7.5 doesn't sound crazy at all. And then I start layering in the form Auburn has shown recently. Auburn is 2-8 straight up in their last 10 games. That's a stretch where consistency clearly hasn't been there. When I see a team that is 2-8 straight up in their last 10 games laying minus 7.5 on a neutral floor, my brain immediately goes to volatility. Because if this matchup plays out like Auburn's recent stretch, where wins have been rare and stability hasn't been there, that margin of minus 7.5 becomes really difficult to trust. Now I'm not sitting here pretending Mississippi State has had some amazing year. The conversation around them acknowledges that Mississippi State has had a tough year, and that reality matters. But tournament basketball brings a different element, and this game sits inside that tournament environment. What connects for me is the idea that guard play dominates in tournament play, whether it's conference tournaments or the NCAAB tournament, the big dance, guards take over games. And Mississippi State has two guards who can create those moments, Josh Hubbard and Jaden Epps. If this matchup plays out like a guard-driven tournament game, those two can keep Mississippi State within striking distance all night. Another path I see here is the scoring environment suggested by the total of 158.5. That's a big number. And when totals sit at 158.5, games often become possession-heavy and offense-driven, and that actually favors the side getting plus 7.5 because scoring runs tend to go both directions. If Mississippi State already showed they can score 91 against Auburn in a previous meeting, it's not hard to imagine another offensive game where both teams trade baskets and the margin floats around that number. And I keep circling back to that earlier meeting, Mississippi State 91 points, Mississippi State winning by 6. That data point just sits there staring at me. Another piece that floats around this matchup is the Mississippi State moneyline sitting at plus 260. That's interesting because if Mississippi State already beat Auburn outright once this season, and Auburn is currently 2-8 straight up in their last 10 games, the idea of Mississippi State making another push in this game isn't impossible to picture. There's even mention of a half-unit moneyline play on Mississippi State floating around, which again reinforces the thought that the gap between these teams might not be as large as the spread suggests. So when I connect all of it together, the neutral floor at Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, Tennessee, Auburn laying minus 7.5, the total at 158.5, Mississippi State already beating Auburn once this season by scoring 91 and winning by 6, Auburn sitting at 2-8 straight up in their last 10 games, and the presence of guards like Josh Hubbard and Jaden Epps in a tournament setting where guard play dominates. The scenario that keeps forming in my head is a competitive game that stretches deep into the second half without one side completely pulling away. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at Mississippi State plus 7.5. Last game of this video is Wyoming versus UNLV, the lean here is over 155.5. Let me walk through why, because when I start looking at this matchup inside the Mountain West tournament environment, everything about the numbers and the trends keeps pushing my brain toward offense. This game takes place on Wednesday, March 11, 2026, with a 3 p.m. start time, which also means a noon Pacific Coast equivalent start time. That early tournament start can sometimes create weird rhythm games, but what connects for me is the offensive direction both teams have been trending. The total sitting here is 155.5. And when I start stacking the data points on top of that number, it feels like the scoring environment might push past it. The first thing that jumps out is the impact of Damarian Dennis for Wyoming. He's a Wyoming shooting guard who entered the starting lineup 8 games ago, and since stepping into that role he's averaging 16 points per game. That's a huge piece of context because lineup changes that introduce consistent scoring tend to reshape a team's offensive identity. And when Damarian Dennis entered the starting lineup 8 games ago, Wyoming started playing games that leaned toward offense. Wyoming has gone over the total in 5 of their last 8 games since Dennis moved into the starting lineup. So if this matchup plays out like Wyoming's recent stretch with Dennis producing 16 points per game, the Cowboys suddenly look like a team capable of pushing pace and contributing heavily to the scoreboard. And then I layer in the previous head-to-head meeting between these two teams earlier this year. In that game they combined to score 164 points. That's already above the current total of 155.5. And inside that same game Wyoming scored 98 points. 98. That's an explosive offensive output in a matchup between these exact teams. So if the game script even partially resembles that earlier meeting, Wyoming scoring at a high level and the combined score pushing up to 164, then the total of 155.5 starts to feel a little low. And then the other side of the equation adds even more fuel to that idea. UNLV has gone over the total in 10 of their last 11 games. That's an extremely strong over trend. 10 of the last 11 games for UNLV have finished over the total, which suggests their games consistently drift into high-scoring territory regardless of opponent. So now I'm stacking multiple layers. Wyoming trending over in 5 of their last 8 games since Damarian Dennis entered the starting lineup 8 games ago averaging 16 points per game. UNLV going over the total in 10 of their last 11 games, and the previous meeting between these teams producing a combined 164 points with Wyoming scoring 98. If this matchup plays out like that combination suggests, Wyoming's offense clicking with Dennis, UNLV continuing its 10 of the last 11 over trend, and both teams remembering the tempo from the earlier meeting that produced 164 points, then the total of 155.5 looks like a number that can be reached through pace alone. Another path I see here comes from the tournament setting itself. Inside the Mountain West tournament, especially on a Wednesday afternoon tip like this at 3 p.m. which translates to noon Pacific Coast equivalent, teams often lean towards scoring because they're trying to advance rather than slow things down. When neither side has anything to lose, games sometimes open up. More transition, more quick shots, more possessions. And when possessions climb, totals like 155.5 start getting tested quickly. So when I connect the entire picture, Mountain West tournament setting on Wednesday, March 11, 2026, the 3 p.m. start time and noon Pacific Coast equivalent, Damarian Dennis entering the starting lineup 8 games ago and averaging 16 points per game. Wyoming going over in 5 of the last 8 games since that lineup change, the earlier matchup producing 164 combined points with Wyoming scoring 98, and UNLV going over the total in 10 of their last 11 games. The offensive path just keeps appearing again and again. Yeah, that's why the lean sticks at over 155.5. Alright, that wraps it up for all 4 college basketball matchups on March 11th. Now I'm really curious how you guys are seeing these spots. Drop AZ in the comments and tell me which of these games stood out to you the most or if you're reading one of these matchups completely differently. Those conversations always make the next breakdowns even better. And one more quick reminder, the channel is pushing toward 2K subscribers, so if you enjoy these deep dive college basketball breakdowns during tournament time and you want to see more slates like this, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. More breakdowns coming soon, same raw format, same thinking out loud style, and a lot more college basketball to talk about.